You've eaten chicken this week. Statistically, almost certainly. It's the most consumed meat on the planet, and every single piece of it, whether it's a breast, a wing, or a nugget shaped like a dinosaur, came from a female bird. Here's the question nobody asks while they're eating it. Where are the males? Chickens, like every other species that reproduces sexually, hatch in roughly equal numbers of male and female. 50% of every batch of eggs that hatches in a commercial hatchery is male, and yet you have almost certainly never once in your entire life bought a package labeled rooster meat at a grocery store. So somewhere between the egg and your plate, half the population simply disappears. That disappearance isn't a mystery. It's an industry standard practice, happening at a scale most people have no framework for. And the reason behind it comes down to something surprisingly simple. Chickens have been split through decades of selective breeding into two completely different products, and male birds are the wrong shape for either one. To understand why, you have to understand that the chicken sitting on your dinner plate and the chicken that laid the egg in your fridge this morning are not, functionally, the same animal anymore. They used to be. For most of human history, a chicken was a chicken. You kept a flock, they laid eggs, and eventually some of them became dinner, males included. But starting in the mid-20th century, poultry breeding split into two entirely separate genetic tracks, each one optimized with almost obsessive precision for a single outcome. One track produces broiler chickens, the meat birds. These are engineered through generations of selective breeding to grow enormous amounts of muscle mass in an extremely short window of time. A modern broiler chicken reaches full market weight in about 6 weeks. To put that in perspective, a chicken from the 1950s took roughly 3 times as long to reach a fraction of that size. This isn't a small improvement. It's one of the most dramatic transformations achieved through selective breeding in the entire history of agriculture, and both the male and female broiler chickens grow at nearly identical rates. This matters because it means the meat industry has no real reason to separate them by sex at all. A male broiler chick and a female broiler chick are, for all practical purposes, interchangeable. Both get raised. Both end up as meat. The other track produces laying hens, and this is where the entire problem originates. Laying hens have been selectively bred for one purpose and one purpose only: to produce as many eggs as physically possible, as efficiently as possible, for as long as possible. A modern commercial laying hen can produce over 300 eggs a year, an output that would have seemed almost impossible a century ago. But that intense genetic specialization came at a direct cost. These birds were never bred to grow meat efficiently. Their bodies put nearly all of their biological resources into egg production instead. A male chick from a laying breed will never lay a single egg, obviously. And his body also grows slowly, inefficiently, and produces meat that's genuinely uneconomical to raise at any commercial scale. He is, in the most literal biological sense, an animal built for a job he cannot do, hatched into an industry that has no use for the only thing his body is actually good at. This is the entire explanation sitting underneath the question. It's not that farmers dislike male chickens or that rooster meat tastes bad. It's that an entire global industry spent decades breeding two separate animals for two separate purposes. And somewhere in that process, male laying breed chicks became a byproduct with no assigned function at all. So what actually happens to them? Within hours of hatching, chicks at commercial hatcheries go through a process the industry calls sexing, where trained workers determine the sex of each chick, often through a method called vent sexing that examines subtle physical differences invisible to almost anyone without specific training. Once identified, male chicks from egg-laying breeds are typically culled almost immediately, generally through one of two methods currently used across most of the industry: maceration, which uses high-speed grinding equipment designed to cause instant death, or gas exposure using carbon dioxide, intended to induce unconsciousness before death occurs. The scale here is genuinely difficult to hold in your head. Estimates suggest that roughly 6 billion male chicks are culled globally every single year, almost entirely from egg-laying breeds, almost entirely within the first day of their lives. That number isn't a rounding error or an edge case. It's the direct, predictable, and completely expected output of how the modern egg industry was engineered to function. For decades, this practice generated remarkably little public attention, largely because it happens entirely out of view. inside hatcheries most people will never see or think about, disconnected by design from the actual egg carton sitting in a supermarket refrigerator. That's finally starting to change, and the reason is genuinely interesting from a technological standpoint. Several countries, Germany and France among the first, have begun implementing something called in ovo sexing, a technology that allows hatcheries to determine a chick's sex while it's still developing inside the egg, before the embryo has developed the capacity to feel pain, using either hormone detection in the eggshell or, more recently, spectroscopic analysis of blood vessels visible through the shell. If a male is detected, the egg can be removed and repurposed, often for uses like animal feed, before a chick ever actually hatches. Germany officially banned traditional chick culling starting in 2022, becoming the first country to do so at a national level, with several other European countries actively developing similar legislation. But here's the genuinely uncomfortable complication sitting underneath even that solution. In ovo sexing doesn't actually save male chick lives in any meaningful sense. It simply moves the exact same outcome earlier, to a developmental stage most people are more comfortable not thinking too hard about. The male chicken still never exists as an adult bird. The fundamental economic problem, an animal genetically engineered for a purpose it structurally cannot fulfill, remains completely unchanged. The technology addresses a specific, narrow ethical objection about a chick's capacity to suffer at the moment of culling. It does absolutely nothing to address the deeper structural question of why roughly half of every generation of laying breed chickens has no viable place in the system at all. There is, at least theoretically, an obvious alternative here, and it's worth sitting with why it isn't actually happening at any meaningful scale. Why not simply raise the male chicks for meat instead of culling them? Some smaller farms and specific culinary traditions genuinely do this. Coq au vin, the classic French dish, was traditionally built specifically around older roosters, birds whose meat had toughened enough through age and use that slow braising became a genuine culinary necessity rather than a stylistic choice. Some countries with less rigidly industrialized poultry systems still commonly raise male laying breed chickens for meat, and the meat itself is genuinely edible. This isn't a biological impossibility, it's an economic one. The math is fairly unforgiving once you actually run it. A male chick from a laying breed requires roughly the same amount of feed, water, housing infrastructure, and labor input as a broiler chicken specifically engineered for rapid meat production, but he grows dramatically slower and ultimately produces significantly less usable meat per unit of resources invested. In an industry where profit margins are measured in fractions of a cent per bird, raising a genetically inefficient animal for meat when a purpose-built alternative already exists simply doesn't make economic sense at any meaningful commercial scale. The male chick isn't unwanted because anyone actively dislikes him. He's unwanted because he sits in an uncomfortable, unprofitable gap between two increasingly specialized and optimized systems, neither of which was ever designed with him in mind. This entire situation is, in a strange and specific way, a direct byproduct of genuinely remarkable agricultural efficiency. The same intense selective breeding that gave modern laying hens their extraordinary 300-plus egg-a-year output and gave modern broiler chickens their astonishingly fast 6-week growth cycle also created a structural gap between the two systems where roughly half of every generation simply falls through with no assigned economic role at all. It's not a flaw in the system exactly. It's closer to being the direct, unavoidable mathematical consequence of exactly how well the system was optimized to do two very different, very specific jobs. There are researchers and companies actively working on genuinely creative solutions to this. Some are experimenting with dual-purpose chicken breeds, birds specifically engineered to lay a reasonable number of eggs while also growing into genuinely usable meat, essentially attempting to rebuild something closer to what a general-purpose chicken looked like before the industry split into two hyper-specialized tracks decades ago. Others are pursuing more advanced in ovo sexing technology that could eventually be adopted globally rather than remaining limited to a handful of European countries. None of these solutions is remotely simple, and none of them fully resolves the underlying economic and biological tension sitting at the very center of the entire industry. So the next time you crack an egg into a pan, there's a genuinely uncomfortable statistic sitting quietly behind that simple, ordinary act. For every hen laying eggs in a commercial facility somewhere, there was, at some earlier point, a brother. Genetically identical in almost every meaningful way except one single chromosome, who never got the chance to grow up. Not because of anything he did, but because an industry built on decades of extraordinary genetic optimization had, Quite simply, no place left for him.